Thank you for being here. I'm Ann Jacobs. I'm the director of the Prisoner Reentry Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to John Jay College of Criminal Justice and to the release of this report, When All Else Fails, Finding the Family, by Mitali, Nagrecha, and Mary, I never can say Mary's middle name, Katzenstein. We are very pleased to have this opportunity to co-sponsor this event with the Center for Community Alternatives and to share this really, I think, important report with you. This panel is part of the occasional series on reentry research that's sponsored by the Prisoner Reentry Institute. This year we took our inspiration for the series from the National Academy of Sciences report on the growth of incarceration, its causes and consequences, and that we hope that in addition to joining us for today's panel, you'll join us on March 5th for a discussion of Todd Clear's new work about the impact of the growth of incarceration on communities, and on April 16th for an event that we're co-sponsoring with the Department of Probation on intimate partner violence and the challenges of that in a context of community supervision. So today we have wonderful presenters, and we're very fortunate to have my colleague at John Jay, Dr. Karin Martin, moderating the panel. Dr. Martin is the assistant professor in the Department of Public Management here at John Jay, and she works with us at the Prisoner Reentry Institute to direct the TAO Public Policy Advocacy Fellowship that we had the opportunity to create this year. She's actually a California transplant where she studied psychology at Stanford, earned an MPP and an MA in political science and a PhD in public policy, all at Berkeley?
Yes.
Yes, all at Berkeley. And then did postdoc work at the psychology department at UCLA. Her focus is on research that deals directly with a range of the issues that are of concern and interest to the Prisoner Reentry Institute and to most of us in this room, including an emphasis on institutional interpretations of criminal behaviors such as in sentencing, using money to punish, which is very relevant to today's conversation, policing, and in her research she explores the role of extra legal factors like race, gender, education, economics through the criminal justice system. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Martin, who's going to introduce the panel and manage the time. We are committed to covering a lot of territory between now and 11 a.m. And letting you go very promptly, because we know you have other things to do today. So with that, I want to thank you again for being here, and thank you for moderating, and everybody for being here. Karin?
Thank you. So welcome. Very nice to see you this morning. I'm going to do very brief introductions because you have this, and I want to save time for discussion. We're going to start with Mitali Nagrecha, who is now in private practice, and she's going to give us an overview of the report that she wrote with Professor Katzenstein. And then we're going to move to, I think we said you're going to go to Patricia Warth, and she will go over the policy recommendations. And then we're going to have David Silva, who has his own experience with criminal justice debt, who's now at Fortune Society, and then Cammett, who's a professor and also an attorney at the CUNY School of Law. Sound good? Okay, and I'm going to keep time. Should I do this here or there? Are these on?
Can everyone hear? Okay, well, good morning, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Prisoner Reentry Institute for hosting this event. This paper, When All Else Fails, Finding the Family, talks about criminal justice debt, or payment obligations that are generally owed to the state as a result of a person's involvement in the criminal justice system. Examples include court fees or jail fees. We also include child support debt because of policies that make it so that child support debt continues to accrue while individuals are in prison. Mary and I and others in the field have written about the reentry impact of criminal justice debt on the individuals who are returning home from prison. What we add in this paper is that criminal justice debt also impacts the returning individuals, families, and communities. So It's the individuals, families, and friends who are also often from low-income backgrounds and struggling financially, who band together to help their family members pay in order to avoid the consequences of non-payment, which can include warrants and incarceration. Before I get into the details of the paper, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk more generally about criminal justice debt and how Mary and I got to asking this particular question about family impact. Criminal justice debt has been in the news quite a bit recently in connection with the issues in Ferguson, Missouri. And interestingly, in that community, criminal justice debt was said to have contributed significantly to the distrust of police that was expressed in the aftermath of the death of Michael Brown. One of the reports said that Ferguson, which is a town of about 21,000 people, issued 33,000 arrest warrants in 2013. And most of these were for nonviolent traffic offenses, and they were disproportionately targeted towards minority and poor community members. This particular report grew out of a few things that Mary and I were thinking about as we researched criminal justice debt. The first was that policy recommendations around criminal justice debt typically suggest that jurisdictions should implement more accurate ability to pay determinations. And as we thought about this, we started thinking more about what it is the financial lives of returning prisoners look like and what you would actually take into account to get a very accurate ability to pay determination. Second, we had heard more and more that jurisdictions were withdrawing money from inmate commissary accounts to fund some of the debts, and so you'd pay while you were in prison for child support and fees. But what we also knew is that the money in those inmate accounts generally comes from individuals, family, and friends on the outside who are putting money into these accounts so that their family members can, buy things while they're in the inside. And the third sort of issue that we were thinking about was Massachusetts had implemented a jail fee. So it was a daily charge for individuals who were in a particular jail in Massachusetts that was then found to be illegal. And so they had set up a settlement fund to return the jail fee paid back to the individuals who had been in prison. And we spoke to the attorney that was administering this jail fee, and we were told that it was actually common for the individual who had been in prison to tell him that it wasn't him to have paid in the first place, that it had been family members and friends who had paid that jail fee, and so that sometimes he was told that that money had to go back to that family and friends. And so it was these three things that had Mary and I thinking more critically about the family impact of criminal justice debt. For this paper, we interviewed about 40 people with criminal justice histories in New York and New Jersey. And we did in-depth 45-minute interviews talking about sort of what the person's financial life looks like when they come home. So we asked them about both their income and their expenses, including criminal justice debt, other debts, their cost of living, how they were, where they were living, how they were eating. We asked about whether they were working, what their prospects for employment were, including their level of education and how long they had been out. We asked about any public assistance, and we asked about family assistance. Again, we were trying to get a real sense of the individual's ability to pay and their networks of support. We also asked individuals about their experience with the collection mechanisms that jurisdictions use to collect debt, including garnishment, additional surcharges, driver's license revocation, and at worst, warrants and reincarceration. So I will talk, we had two main findings, and the third section of the report covers policy recommendations, which Patricia will discuss. So the first finding was that the criminalization of financial obligations that others in the field have also written about in recent years very much came through in our first-person accounts. And so we found that the criminal justice debt and the related enforcement mechanisms greatly impacted the lives of the individuals we spoke to. As one of our interviewees said, punishment is everywhere. And so Of the 39 people we spoke to, 33 had criminal justice debt that was non-child support debt. And I should also briefly note that our interviewees were in New York and New Jersey, and they're not the worst of it in terms of criminal justice debt. And so I think when you hear some of the stories, I think that's particularly interesting because I think it can get a lot worse. 27 of the 39 had child support debt, and these numbers are the numbers of people who are currently struggling with this debt. So for example, in New York, I think a lot of people pay off their fees when they're in prison, and so it's not as big of an issue after. And again, what was interesting is how pervasive the impact was sort of across the spectrum with people with very different stories after they came home. So on the one end, we had Yaya, and Yaya told us that he read at a 4th grade level and had struggled with addiction for 30 years, including at the time we interviewed him. And Yaya at that time was in a halfway house in an addiction treatment program. And so he told us that he was very frustrated that he couldn't even really understand the processes around his criminal justice debt or how much child support debt he had. And he talked about having worked inconsistently over the last 30 years for low wages as his child support has continued to tick up to amounts he's really not aware of. And he mentioned, for example, that he had faced arrest at least 3 times on his non-payment of child support. Another example sort of on the other end of the spectrum was Bob. So Bob had been out of prison at the time for about 4 or 5 years. He had come out in 2007. And since 2007, Bob had earned a master's degree in social work, and he had consistently worked 2 management level jobs in his field. Prior to 2007, he had been in and out of jail for short periods of time for offenses related to addiction. And so years later, having earned a master's degree and having worked, he still had $20,000 in child support debt and $13,000 in DMV debt. He spoke about continuing to struggle to pay that debt, the negative impacts of garnishment, and how he really saw his debt as a barrier to career progress. The second finding, and really the key finding of the report, is that individuals coming home were only making it through dependence on a network of family and friends. And so we found that 28 of the 39 individuals, or 70%, talked about their reliance on family and friends. By way of illustration, 12 people told us that they actually got cash from their family and friends. 15 said that they lived with a family member, so they relied on family and friends for housing, and they often paid little to no rent. 7 said they are only really able to feed themselves through a reliance on family and friends. I'm going to tell one story to sort of conclude that illustrates both of these themes, and then you'll later hear from David. David's story is also featured in the report. So I'll tell the story of Monk. Monk, at the time of the interview, had been out of prison for 3 years. He's a 36-year-old African-American male. And Monk talks about how when he was in prison, he received notice that he now had child support obligations. And he talks about how he wrote back to the notice and explained that he was in prison making something like under $1 an hour when he worked, and that he couldn't pay the child support while in prison, but that he had every intention of doing so when he got back. So he explains that he was released and he went before the family court judge to find that he had accrued $15,000 in child support over the 3.5 years that he spent in prison. And he talks about having had no idea that the child support would accrue, and he was told what people are told, which is that the judge has no authority to reduce those arrears. And so Monk talks about how he was then given 60 days to start paying his child support. Monk also had a number of DMV surcharges at that point. And so he then talks about how this is when his family sort of started helping him. He talks about how when he came out and had those 60 days, he wasn't able to start paying because he couldn't find a job in those 60 days for many of the reasons that we all know. It's hard to find a job when you come home. And so he would borrow $25 here and there from family to make a gesture to the court to say, you know, I'm trying and I'm looking for work, but this is all I can pay right now. He talks about doing that because he was trying to avoid warrants and incarceration, but he was in fact arrested twice for non-payment. He talks about how he would get arrested and he would again have to borrow money from family and friends to secure his release, and so he'd have to pay something towards the child support to then be released from prison. He talks about how he would go into court and explain to the judge that he wasn't able to find work, and he would demonstrate that he was trying, but again, the child support continued to accrue. Monk was also trying to work, so he was looking for work, and the only job he could find was working for his sister's daycare, and she paid him something like $400 a month, and he would then take $250 and give it to his girlfriend to support their household. They lived together. And Monk talked about appreciating that that wasn't enough to cover their expenses, but it was really at the time the best he can do. He talked about how, because he then only had something like $150 left a month, he would still rely on his mother, for example, to give him money for interview clothes as he continued to look for additional employment. He talked a lot about the emotional support he also got from his mother and his sister especially. So, for example, his mother and sister supported his daughter to the extent that they could when Monk was in prison, and he said that that really helped better relations with the child's mother and to also financially support his child while he couldn't do that. And he saw that as a very big help. He talks about how his mother and sister paid his DMV debt, or parts of it, and again, that helped him sort of avoid a slew of consequences for non-payment there, including driver's license revocation. And he talks about how his sister was instrumental in helping him negotiate and talk to his child's mother so they could come to a more reasonable contribution plan so that he could support his daughter, but keeping in mind sort of his reality at the time. So I'm going to end with a statement by Monk. This is sort of how he explained to us his experience. I've edited it a tiny bit for clarity. And so Monk tells us, when you come home, you might still have fines from the DMV. Lots of jobs need a driver's license now. So if your driver's license got suspended and you have surcharges, you have to deal with that on top of finding a job. So in my situation, you have to get your driver's license back together, pay rent, pay fines so no warrants, pay child support so no warrants. And now everything is falling short in the house. You want to take care of your kid, but you're taking care of all these fines. As a grown man, you don't want to be laying in your family house. You're a grown man, you need your own. You come home from prison with more problems than you went in with. It doesn't stop because you got locked up.
In 2007, the Center for Community Alternatives issued its report, Sentencing for Dollars, the Financial Consequences of a Criminal Conviction. In so doing, we became one of the first organizations to really illuminate and highlight this issue of financial debt resulting from criminal justice involvement as a so-called collateral or life-altering consequence of a criminal conviction. That's why we're so pleased to be working with Mitali and Mary on this very important issue, and to see this issue starting to get more and more attention and discussion, the much needed attention and discussion. Now, Mitali summarized what her research revealed, that criminal justice debt has ripple effects far beyond the individual to the family and to communities as a whole. Communities and families that are challenged already by the burden of poverty. My job here today is to summarize the report's policy recommendations. But to help you understand these recommendations and to put them into some context, I want to first take a step back and talk about some of the common features of criminal justice debt, or the laws or features of the laws and the ordinances and the policies that give rise to this debt. I think one of the first features is that there tends to be a significant gap between what the laws are intended to accomplish and what they actually accomplish. Most debt
or most laws and ordinances and statutes that give rise to criminal justice debt are not related to the crime. They're not intended to make the victim whole, with the exception of restitution, of course. Rather, their purpose is revenue enhancement, essentially shifting the burden of the cost of the criminal justice system from the taxpayers to the people caught up in the net of the criminal justice system. But as Mary's and Mitali's report reveals, what is actually accomplished is less revenue enhancement and more enduring lifelong punishment for the person who's caught up in the criminal justice system and the person's family and friends. Another feature is that there's a dearth of information about the costs and benefits of these laws and policies that give rise to this debt. There are way too many unanswered questions, and so we're enacting these laws and policies without knowing critical information. We don't know, for example, how well do these laws and policies actually enhance revenue? Do we spend more in trying to enforce them and trying to collect the debt than we actually get once we do collect the debt? And this is especially true if failure to pay leads to incarceration. Aren't we then spending more than what we get in terms of revenue enhancement? Do these laws contribute to policy and economic deprivation of people and communities? I think Ferguson gives rise to another question. Do they contribute to distrust of the criminal justice system? And do they promote increased arrests so that we can get more money? I mean, all of these very important questions. Another, of course, important question that's related to PRI, of course, is how do these laws affect a person's ability to successfully re-enter the community as a law-abiding citizen capable of living a dignified life in the community? None of these questions have been sufficiently explored, and yet we keep continuing to pass these laws and ordinances. We keep trying to up the ante in terms of shifting the burden of the criminal justice system onto people who are caught up in its net. Another important feature, and one that was prominently discussed in CCA's 2007 report, is the fact that these laws and policies are enacted in a vacuum, with little or no consideration for the existence of already existing financial penalties. So each newly enacted financial penalty is viewed in isolation and not in the context of what's already existing and the financial burden that a person will already face. And of course, related to that, another feature is the lack of transparency. And what we see across jurisdictions is that these financial obligations are scattered throughout many different areas of the law. So what does that mean? Well, it means that every time somebody enacts a new one, they don't know of where the existing ones are because they're just scattered all over the place. But just as importantly, every time a person contemplates pleading guilty to a criminal offense, he or she has no idea what the financial repercussions of that guilty plea will be. And his or her lawyer is not well positioned to advise that person because they're just scattered all over the place. Another thing that we see about criminal justice debt is that it's imposed along a continuum of the criminal justice system. So we see, for example, in some jurisdictions, the debt happens up front as soon as you apply for public defender services. In Newark, for example, I understand that an ordinance was passed to increase the cost of getting a public defender from $50 to $200. Then you see more debt once the court imposes a sentence. The court pronounces it. And then as soon as that sentence is imposed, then you see more debt when the clerk stamps papers imposing more debt. And then if the person goes to prison, as Mitali talked about, you see even more debt accumulating. Debt for example, to see a doctor. Debt if you pick up a disciplinary ticket. Debt for collect phone calls. In New York, debt just for being in prison. You're charged for that. And then if you're on supervision, even more debt. I was recently talking to a local commissioner of probation who talked about how the debt, as he sees it, bleeds them out. Bleeds out people who are on probation. Debt for, you're charged for a drug test, you're charged for home confinement, you're charged for, some probation offices charge you for doing the pre-sentence investigation report. Just all along the continuum. And then finally, the last feature that we see is often this debt is imposed with no consideration for the person's ability to pay. And I think Mitali and Mary really touched upon this very well in their report. And in fact, that's what drove them to really to write it. So these are the common features, and it's from these features that we make our policy recommendations. So of course, not surprisingly, our first policy recommendation is greater transparency. Unless and until the financial obligations are transparent, until we know what they are, where they are, and how they touch people's lives, we'll continue to impose more and more debt without consideration for existing ones. And of course, people charged with crimes will continue to plead to guilty pleas without having any idea of what that really means for the rest of their lives. So to enhance transparency, we recommend that jurisdictions develop an inventory of all existing financial penalties. We also recommend that all existing financial penalties should be consolidated into one moderate fee. Not only will this promote greater transparency, but I think it will also promote a greater ability to collect. In addition, we believe that restitution should not be included in this moderate fee. That, in fact, restitution should be prioritized as its own obligation, because it's really the only one that's related to the offense. And if the amount of restitution exceeds the one fee, then the fee should be waived for those who cannot pay it, or at least modified. Again, that's the way to prioritize restitution. Our second policy recommendation is that financial obligations stemming from the criminal justice system should be imposed only based upon a person's ability to pay. Those who live below the poverty line should not be required to pay. And judges should have the discretion to waive or modify financial obligations so that people and their families are not punished more harshly just because they're poor. Our third policy recommendation is to require jurisdictions to have a reentry impact statement prior to enacting, or as part of consideration of enacting any law or ordinance that would impose additional financial debt for a person caught up in the criminal justice system. In other words, this would require legislatures to assess how imposition of additional financial penalties will impact people's ability to reintegrate into the community in a manner that allows the person to live a law-abiding, dignified life in the community. I think doing so, this reentry impact statement, is important as a way to keep our eyes on the prize and to ensure that we're not trying to increase public coffers in a manner that actually diminishes public safety. Finally, well, in addition, we sort of carve out separate recommendations with regard to child support. And our recommendations here are really designed to sort of require us to have a realistic view of child support and a realistic view of what people can actually do to support their children. And I want to add, I say this from the perspective of working with people who have child support obligations and are unable to pay. People don't want to not pay. People want to be able to support their children. And I think we've got to start to come from that assumption instead of the reverse assumption, which is that, you know, people don't want to pay. That's not the reality. So I think we need to prevent the accumulation of child support arrears that somebody cannot realistically pay, you know, and this accumulation that occurs while people are incarcerated. And this is best done by providing for an automatic administrative suspension of child support obligations for any person who is incarcerated and because they are incarcerated are unable to pay their child support obligations. And Mitali mentioned, you know, people who are incarcerated earn less than $1 an hour. They earn cents an hour. It's usually between 15 and 25 cents in the New York State Department of Correctional Services. You can't pay child support with that. You can buy your soap, you can buy your shampoo, but you can't pay child support earning that much money. We also recommend that license forfeiture should be a measure of last resort. And when I say license forfeiture, I not only mean licenses for driving, but licenses for certain professions. More and more professions require, don't allow people to be licensed if they have child support debt. Indeed, I just filled out my attorney registration, my biannual attorney registration. 4 questions. One of the questions asked me about child support. So, that's something that if you can't work, how can you pay your child support? So license forfeiture should be a measure of last resort, and only when there's compelling evidence that failure to pay is willful and not a function of somebody's inability to pay. Finally, our last recommendation is that we have a moratorium on imposition of further financial obligations for people caught up in the criminal justice system. We need to take a step back. We need to take a deep breath. We need to get the information and answer important questions about the costs and benefits of this debt. We need to come to terms with what the purpose of the debt really is, or what the purpose of financial obligations really are, and so you have some clarity about that. We need to be realistic about what it means for people and how it affects individuals, families, and communities. And we need to enact all these other policy recommendations. And until we do that, we should have a moratorium and not enact additional financial obligations for individuals. So with that, I turn it over to David.
Good morning, everyone. Basically, I'm here to give you my personal story with these type of issues. The first time my license was suspended, I was 18. I'm 50 today, and I still don't have my license. It was suspended for a marijuana offense. So going in and out of the system, the debts continue to accumulate. A lot of interest fees and more fines. And I experienced these things firsthand, because early on, they didn't have as many. They didn't have them court fees or the public defender fees. I wasn't even aware of them until 2006, when I was released after serving 38 months in a state facility. I corresponded to each and every municipality to try to resolve these municipal matters. They were DMV, motor vehicle. I wrote to everybody, and the state facility would tell me that they're not going to spend the money to transport me to municipal court to handle these matters. So after serving the 38 months, I wasn't released because I had 7 different warrants in 7 counties from these municipal matters. So it took about another 2 or 3 weeks for them to finally let me go. I was released on a Saturday. I go to the first court hearing that I had for the municipal matter in Irvington, New Jersey. And it was a driving violation. So he incarcerated me again. After serving the 38 months, I had all my paperwork explaining to him I was just released. I had all my letters saying, I've been writing to you for about 3 years now trying to resolve this. He didn't want to hear it. He put me back into custody and put me in the county jail. So the debt fell on my family. They knew I was really trying. I was taking responsibility and trying to, be accountable for my actions and stuff. So the debt fell on my family. I have a mother who's been sick for many years. She probably pays more on medication than some people pay for rent. So how do I feel as a grown man turning to my mother and saying, can you help me pay this thing? It wasn't a good feeling. So it would push me back out there. It would put me to the point where, the frustrating point where I would just say, you know what? I'm not going to pay it. I'll deal with it another way. And for a long time, you live almost like a fugitive for these little fines, because you don't really have the means to pay it. You go back and forth to court, you explain, I have no money, I don't have a job. I even went with a promise of employment. If the judge would have lifted the restriction on my license, I would have got an excellent paying job. And they still said, sorry, it's up to you to pay this debt. So in 2009, I came across a program in Newark, New Jersey. It was called the Reentry Legal Services. I think Cory Booker and Volunteer Lawyers for Justice and I think some Rutgers law students were putting this nonprofit together. And we started to consolidate all of the different fines throughout New Jersey that I had for driving violations, which were almost at $30,000. So what release was able to do was address the court matters, the fines, and a lot of the tickets dated back to like '86. And they were able to consolidate, even eliminate some of the fines, but they still said I had to pay the court fees and some other surcharges. They said there was no legal grounds for me to be able to not pay that surcharge for motor vehicle. The interest rate was outrageous, so I ended up having to use again the Volunteer Lawyers for Justice to file bankruptcy. In order to, and that's not even a high debt for an individual to have to file bankruptcy. But that was my only way out, not, so I wouldn't have to pay all that money. So now I'm pretty much down to I was down to $300 actually. And just a few months ago, I went to the Department of Motor Vehicle. The judge said I don't have no holds on my license. I can go apply for it. So when I go to the Department of Motor Vehicle, they're taking a little long. They came out of the back room with another $2,000. So when I said I showed them my paperwork saying I already addressed that in Woodbridge, New Jersey. It had 2 different docket numbers. So I go back in front of the judge and he tells me it must have slipped through the cracks. So now I'm pretty close. I should have my license by, I'm hoping by the summer of this year finally, and I'll be able to work in Jersey. Not that I don't love Fortune Society. I love Fortune. It's just a heck of a commute back and forth. So, and the court, the public defender's fees, those things went on my credit report. The court judgments went on my credit report. Every time I would try to get out of Newark, New Jersey, or out of, quote unquote, these hoods, these bad neighborhoods that I grew up in, I would always have that barrier because they would either do the credit check, and it wasn't looking good with all them court judgments, or they would do the background check. So that was another barrier that it was causing me. Some jobs even do credit checks to see if you can get that job. So it was a tough experience. I did all I could to take accountability, but they just make it really hard, especially once you're in custody. If you're in a state facility, they're not, it's up to you to take care of it when you're released. That's pretty much it.
Well, thank you, David, for telling your story, and thank you for this report. It's a very important report because it does represent the voices of people who have these experiences. I'm Ann Cammett, and I teach at CUNY Law School now, but for many years I did policy work around child support enforcement. I was also a legal aid lawyer, and I had many clients that had this issue, so I come to this by way of representing clients who had no idea what they were in for when they were gathering child support enforcement. So my task here today is to drill down a little bit more on the inflexibility of the child support scheme to let you know on a policy level how this occurred, how we got to where we are through the intersection of many policies that don't take account of other systems, right? And I want to do that through this little PowerPoint that I have here. It's a one-pager, but it'll help follow and track some of the policy decisions that we've made as a country around child support enforcement and what that means. And I have to say, I agree wholeheartedly with your recommendations, Patricia, and also this notion that we need to start thinking about child support differently. That's a conversation for another time, but for right now, let's talk a little bit about where we are. So essentially, this is all person-driven, right? The idea that, you know, what we're doing is we are creating a scheme that is an inflexible scheme that a person has to address when they get child support arrears, and a lot of it has to do with the work that the Congress did, if you want to call it that, in creating welfare reform, right? That's sort of the highlight of where this issue came from. It didn't start there, but it culminated in welfare reform, where, as David pointed out, many collateral consequences of convictions that flow from child support enforcement were born. And that really comes from the notion that we're transferring the responsibility for poor children to absent parents, right? But in that process, we didn't make any distinction between obligors that had the ability to pay and those who we call dead folks, right, who didn't have the ability to pay but wanted to support their children. And what Congress did actually was put in place all of these very odious requirements for people who had child support debt, regardless of why they had child support debt. And that includes what David was talking about, license suspension, which is completely counterproductive, right? But also garnishment up to 65% of your paycheck, threat of reincarceration, and many other things. But that's really just the beginning. When it comes to the issue of child support enforcement for prisoners, right, there are many gaps in the law, and the anomaly of this is that whether you get child support debt when you're in prison has a lot to do with where you're incarcerated, right? So in a state like New York, for example, in a state like New York, incarceration used to be deemed voluntary unemployment. And I'm not kidding about that, right? For the purposes of child support enforcement, if you have a precipitous drop in income typically, right, you go to court and you tell them, I'm not making any money, please lower my child support until I get back on my feet. But as a matter of policy, in many states in this country still, your criminal activities preclude you from doing that, right? And so what we have is a situation where if you're in a state where you don't, where you're not allowed to modify your child support at all, you get all of this accrual of child support arrears. In 2010, New York State actually changed the law, fortunately, and it allows for incarceration to be the basis of a child support modification, right? The problem is nobody knows it, right? All these prisoners are in there, and what they're thinking, rather logically, I think, is that these agencies are talking to each other. They know I'm incarcerated, they know I'm making 50 cents an hour, they know I can't pay this. How on earth can my child support be going up? But it's based on a policy prerogative that the state has employed, saying basically that your criminal actions should preclude you from getting out of your debt because you're harming your children, right? That's the problem with the state. Indeed, it doesn't end there. One thing we have not talked about with respect to child support debt is interest on that debt. In New York State, child support arrears accrue interest at a compounded rate of 9%, right? This is how you can be in prison for 3 years and come out with, I think, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt is not unusual, right? In that sense, people are accruing interest on debt that they don't even know. But I want to wrap this up because I've got 7 minutes to do this, right? I want to talk about the real kicker here, why it is, and Mitali actually referred to this, which is this notion of no retroactive modifications, right? This idea comes from what we call the Bradley Amendment, right? The Bradley Amendment is a federal law. And in 1986, what happened was this. There was no tracking of child support debt, and people who owed child support would go from state to state, and they would tell the judge a tale about why they couldn't pay their child support. And in fact, it was a real problem. I don't want to delegitimize the problem of lack of support, right? What happened was they would go to a judge, they'd go across state lines, and they'd say, I'm down on my luck, can you eliminate my child support arrears, right? And then the judge would say, okay, start from scratch. The Bradley Amendment was intended to eradicate that problem, right? So that kids would actually begin to get more support. There was an incredible dearth of support. The problem is, Bradley Amendment did not contemplate prisoners or anyone who was confined, anyone who couldn't get back to court to modify, because it went something like this. You are not entitled to a retroactive modification of support, right? You can get a reduction of support from the time you actually go to court, right? But anything that you've accrued up until that point is a judgment, a money judgment under operation of law. That's why it's subject to interest. And there is nothing that a judge can do about it. That's what they tell the prisoners, right, who come out. And if you're formally incarcerated and you're wondering why you have this debt, all they say to you is that the judge can't do anything, right? The real problem is this. This is a truly inflexible scheme. The Bradley Amendment doesn't just apply to people who are incarcerated. It has applied to people who are in mental hospitals. It has applied to prisoners of war, right? In fact, there's a story about a prisoner who was in the first Iraq War in Kuwait, who was a prisoner of war for 5 months and came home and was arrested on a child support claim, right? And the reason is because this inflexible scheme does not allow for retroactive modifications. And in the computer, he was just shown as owing child support. What's worse is he couldn't do anything about it. This has also happened for people who were in prison for many years, who had paternity tests, who said that they weren't even the parents. It applies to them as well, right? So what we have is a reactionary scheme, but it's based on the fact that it's inflexible. It doesn't really get to people who can't afford to pay, and it punishes people who can't afford to pay. The thought I want to leave you with is this. Actually, the way that the scheme works, it works at cross purposes with the goals of the child support system itself. I am interested in families that care about families and children. Right? The idea, though, is the goals of the child support system itself is twofold, right? It's to get financial support for children, and I think we've heard that that's never going to happen under this particular scheme, right? But it's also meant to encourage parental engagement with their children, particularly after a period of incarceration. And it definitely doesn't do that because it drives many formerly incarcerated people into the criminal underground, right? The idea is they want to go, they have to pay this debt, they want to stay out of jail, they're going to do whatever they have to do it, right? And it creates tension within families. And this is exactly what we don't want to do. And this is why this is a counterproductive law for our purposes, and I agree wholeheartedly with your recommendations.
So I'm going to give the panelists a chance to respond to each other if you've had thoughts while each other were talking. If not, I have lots of hard questions to ask you. Does anybody want to? Okay. So my first potentially difficult question is, of course, I'm in the world of policy, so feasibility is always top of my mind. So what do you say to people who will assert that, of course, there's lots of precedent for people using fees for all aspects of government, right? There's park fees, there's tolls, there's sending your kid to do sports in school. So there's the idea that, of course, if you are using the government, that you having to pay a little bit towards it makes sense. And this is also in the context of the country went down the road of having lots of fines, ideally to keep people out of prison, right? Theoretically, that was what the criminologists in the 70s, 80s were saying with alternative sanction movement. Well, if we give people lots of fines, that's actually cheaper, it's costless to the state, but socially costless is all over the place. And people will be punished, but the state will make money. So in that context, what do you say? Why?
Well, I can tell you my clients who are arrested don't feel like they're getting a service from the government.
Right.
They want to pay for it, ironically enough. That's a very simple, alluring way to frame the issue. And I think what we have to do is reframe the issue to talk about how these financial obligations really impair a person's ability to move forward with their lives in a productive manner. And if we really care about our communities, if we really care about public safety, if we really care about everybody in our community able to live productively in a dignified manner, then that should be what drives our policies. And if that's what we focus on, and if that's how we frame the issue, then we can start to have conversations about how these financial obligations marginalize people, how these financial obligations push people out of the workforce, as David has described, because you can't get to your job or you can't get the license to have your job, how these financial obligations push people into the margins of their communities in a way that is unproductive for them, is counterproductive for their families, and is counterproductive for our society as a whole. So I think, there's always simple-minded, alluring ways to frame issues, and I think we need to reframe the issues for people to really make people, or to ask people to really think hard and fast about what do we want for our communities and for the people who live in our communities. And I think if we frame it that way, then I think we can have a more productive discussion.
And if I'm not mistaken, you said these fines were created to help people stay out of prison?
That was the theory.
Kind of, sort of, but if we really do our research, since the collapse of slavery, they've been incarcerating individuals from really minute crimes like loitering and things like that, and then they would put them back on the plantation with fines, and they couldn't even work their ways out back into their own freedom. So is it really like to keep us out of jail, or just to keep the convict leasing thing going on? Because, you're going to work for free anyways, won't you?
And the reality that most people have both, right? Most people have some type of state custody and they have these financial obligations.
Right.
I think that's really true, and I think this is a deeply racist system. I think we should just say that. The disproportionate impact on communities of color is huge. But I think in some ways that's what drives the system, right? If you project all these negative metaphors onto people of color, then you can justify your policy actions toward them without actually having to show that they make policy sense, right? But I think that it really doesn't end there. I think that the question that you brought up about the systems not talking to each other is a really big one, because even people who are fair-minded, who want to make changes, don't necessarily understand how the policy decisions from one branch of government affect another. And until that actually happens, you're not going to be able to live as a cohort.
So right on that topic, there's also this idea that fines are intended to be punitive, and there's this kind of feeling of so what, right? As I'm doing my own research and asking people their opinions about about criminal justice debt, people are like, well, it's supposed to be punitive, so why should I care? And your response would be?
Well, I think my first response is it's important to distinguish between the fines that are sort of considered your punishment or your alternative to your incarceration, and the fines that or the fees and such that we're talking about in the report, which really don't have much of a justification beyond the question you asked before, which is why shouldn't you pay for your time in the system? And so on the second, what I've really struggled with is my gut, which says, well, they just shouldn't exist at all, and needing to have a slightly more sort of moderate policy position, and that's where you sort of land on ability to pay. But even if you're considering sort of the fines that are punishment, I think the so what is, it's not that we've set up a scheme where we're now incentivizing someone to be responsible and work and pay and sort of restructure their lives in a way that will be more productive. We've just created a system that's overly burdensome and doesn't get you there, but rather creates frustration and gets people trapped in a cycle of non-payment and additional penalties. And I think you especially see that with the DMV fines, because you see people doing things that are very practical and doing things that will help them get to work, only to sort of be caught in this cycle. And so, for example, people will have a DMV fine they can't pay, their license gets suspended, they need to get to work, they're trying to get to work, they then get caught driving without a license, obviously not the best decision you've made, but a practical one, and you sort of get caught in this cycle of additional fees and suspensions and such. And so we're creating that system, we're not creating that system that people think we're creating, where we're sort of like, the welfare to work type, let's get people responsible system.
I would also add to people who say it's designed to be punitive, who are we punishing? And I think Mitali in Mary's paper does a wonderful job of exploring that issue. We're punishing families. But I would also layer in, we become so punitive that we make it impossible for people to be productive, law-abiding citizens. And then who are we punishing? We're not just punishing those individuals, we're punishing communities as a whole. So I think that's my response to that question.
And it's out of control. You have individuals who I've seen a man, he must have been at least close to 70, and they had him in custody for a $2 balance. He had a $2 balance. I was like, what are you in here for, sir? $2 from years and years ago. And they arrested him on a warrant. Then they're finding full-blown homeless alcoholics. And they keep bringing them through the system because these individuals, they're homeless, they're full-blown alcoholics. How can they pay whatever amount of fine that they're being given?
So in answer to your question with respect to child support, the answer is no. The purpose of child support is not to be punitive. The purpose of child support is to support children and to create well-being for children. And so if you have a policy that works at cross purposes with that, and with prison reentry, I might add, at the same time, is not a good policy and it should be reconsidered.
Are you guys ready to start asking your questions? Great.
So, I'll use the mic. Alan Rosenthal from the Center for Community Alternatives, Patricia's colleague. Staying on this question of punishment and the way that you, as devil's advocate, have framed it about punishment. So one of the things that's important for us to keep pounding away at is that punishment's just one element of the purpose of our criminal justice system and sentencing. And in 2006, New York joined many other states in adding a fifth goal to the four traditional goals, one of which is punishment. But on the other end of the spectrum is the goal of promoting successful reentry and reintegration. And so when we ask the question, isn't it supposed to be punishment? Yes, in part, but it's supposed to be balanced, just as this report suggests. It's supposed to be balanced in terms of promoting successful reentry and reintegration, and this undermines that part of the criminal justice policy.
Thank you. There was another hand. Yeah.
My name is Irene Gasson. I'm presently at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And something that you didn't mention that I've been looking at is the cost-benefit thing about arresting people for these minor charges, and then you put them in jail. So somebody jumps the turns out for $250, and you're going to pay what? Thousands of dollars. If you can't afford the fine, you're going to pay thousands of dollars to keep them in jail because you lost $250. So from a cost-benefit analysis, the program absolutely is a failure because you have all this incarceration, it's costing a fortune, taxpayers don't want it, for these minor crimes that shouldn't really even be crimes, or shouldn't necessarily, if a person can't pay a fine, find some other way to do it. So I just wanted to throw that into the discussion.
Thank you. And unless you.
No, I mean, I think that's very important. I think there hasn't been a comprehensive assessment of that. And part of the reason why is because, to the extent that some of these fines are used for revenue enhancement, they enhance one part of the budget while the incarceration comes from another part of the budget. So people are just looking at their own little, silo, if you will, of balancing their own little budget and not thinking about how that affects the community as a whole, and how, from my perspective as a taxpayer, what am I really paying? So I think that's a really important question, and we haven't addressed that issue. So.
Yeah, hi. I'm financial coach at Financial Group. My name is Karin, and I actually coach at Fortune Society. I have just a comment and then a kind of basic practical question. My comment is with the child support, I think the worst that I've seen in my coaching are people that have child support that dates back many, many years. The children are grown now. They're in their 20s and 30s. So it's purely to pay back from, many, many years ago. And that seems to be the most difficult one in my book. But it leads me to a basic question that all you lawyers I'm sure can answer. And that is, what about a statute of limitations? Is there, I know for student loans there's no statute of limitations. For taxes there is a statute of limitations. Is there a statute of limitations for some of these kinds of debts?
Well, let me just respond to that with respect to child support. Child support is one of the few things that actually cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. So there is no statute of limitations. And I failed to mention one aspect of this that is particularly onerous, which is that most of the time, if our community, if the community that's affected is low income, the money goes back to the state, right? It doesn't go to the other parent at all. It goes to the state for reimbursement for welfare funds. And so that's another way in which it doesn't benefit the children.
And you can see how that creates all sorts of tension in the family. So, say Mary's incarcerated for a drug charge. Mary has 2 children. Mary's mother takes custody of the children while she's incarcerated. She needs help in financially providing for the children, so she applies for public benefits. Unwittingly now, there's going to be an action, a petition against Mary from the government for the government to recoup from Mary the child support that the government, the fees that the government, or the support that the government's paying for Mary's mother to support her children. So then when Mary gets out of prison, that money's not going to support her children. That money's going back to the government. But you can see how even that system, how that can
create tension between family members. You know, like what does a family member do when they're debating, I need this financial support to help raise these children, but it's going to affect my loved one in prison.
I think the other thing we saw in a number of our interviews is that the person who had come home was in fact now a custodial parent or otherwise contributing to the household in which his child lived, but that person then wasn't paying to the actual child support system, and so they were continuing to accrue debt, continuing to be rearrested, while in fact they were caring for their child and financially contributing informally because they happened to be in the same household.
And garnishment, we need to speak about garnishment. I've seen individuals up to 100% of their wages being garnished. For my first 3 years, trying to resolve my license issues, every time I filed my taxes at the end of the year, they took the whole thing. They sent me 35 cents back.
And I just wanted to go back to this issue of time, essentially. And then people are coming home, a lot of times they are becoming primary caregivers, or they're filling in a lot of household chores and duties, and they are the go-to person who takes care of kids. And in our system, of course, if you have deprivation of liberty, deprivation of property, right? So deprivation of liberty, anybody has time. So you can take your liberty, put you someplace, that is your time, that it has some value in terms of the goals of the criminal justice system. And then there's money, which is property, which is why we're here today, because it doesn't have to come from the person. It can come from, theoretically, anybody. But in the policy recommendations, is there a way to incorporate the value of people's time that could help offset, right, some of the onerous qualities of having this debt?
I think that's a very important question. And Karin and I were talking earlier, so CCA in our Syracuse office is running a program for non-custodial parents who have child support issues and who are having problems with employment because of those issues. That's the target population for the program. It just so happens that a little over 80% of that target population has past criminal justice involvement too. So there definitely is a deep connection between this issue of child support arrears and criminal justice involvement. But what we have found is that in the gap between our program participants being involved in the criminal justice system and trying to get back into the workforce, in that gap of time, they filled a critical role in their families as caretakers. Caretakers for children, but also for the family as a whole. A lot of our program participants, they clean, they cook. They're the ones that are there for the kids. And some of them, when they do get jobs, have a hard time maintaining the jobs because they've been out of the workforce, so they're not earning as much as their partners. And so if a child needs to stay home sick from school, they're the ones who stay home from work to take care of the children. And then that creates all sorts of employment issues. And so what we've been seeing is that their actual contribution to the family, their actual time, their actual energy, their actual compassion and being there is completely devalued. I don't know how to quantify that, but I think that's very important to start to look at, is what are people really contributing, and we're not looking at that at all.
Anybody have ideas how to quantify it? Okay, go ahead.
I just want to make a comment. It's not any easier for the mentally ill. I'm mentally ill and just got a job recently. But when I was in the hospital for the second time, I had to sell my house because I couldn't pay for it. So the state then took the funds that came from the sale of the house. And then they also charged me, I have a lien, okay, for 7 years of being in the hospital at $100,000 a year. So it's not any easier for the mentally ill.
Ingrid Johnson, currently with the Greater Newark Conservancy, formerly a legal aid attorney. And it sounds to me like there's two real issues that we could address on a policy basis. One is getting rid of the Bradley Amendment, which would be huge. And the other is getting states to forgive debt as a parent could do. And I was wondering if you had any ideas on how we could do either.
Yes. So next week, I'm actually going to the National Child Support Enforcement Association. I was invited there by the director of the program for the state of Virginia, to talk about the Bradley Amendment. The Bradley Amendment actually doesn't have to be repealed in order to solve this problem. It just simply has to be modified to restore judicial discretion and to let the states do what makes sense for their coffers, right? The states also owe a good deal of money. It turns out that when they can't recoup money, the federal government gives them less federal money, right? So they have an incentive actually to forgive arrears, and there is an exception within the Bradley Amendment for states to forgive arrears that are owed to the state. And there are many of those programs around the country. The problem is no one knows about them, including the frontline workers. I recently sent students into a child support office to talk about how one might get into the pilot program for arrears forgiveness, and the people that work there didn't even know about it. And this is not uncommon, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work afoot to actually do this. I think they are. I think it's going to be difficult to get the Congress to do much of anything statutorily to change this right now as a practical matter. But there are administrative regulations that interpret the Bradley Amendment that we can work on the executive side. And there's that work going on right now.
I may speak a little to that. There's a lot of street-level bureaucracy going on with that, because I've worked in programs like that. My name is Elaine Garcia, by the way. I worked with Kintock and BI Incorporated. They're both rehabilitation programs in Newark and Elizabeth, New Jersey, and there's a lot of information not sharing. It's a lot of, like we have to find clients that or people that we deem worthy of those type of programs because we're afraid of having things thrown off, of course. But my actual question is about the ability to pay determination. Do you guys have any recommendations? Because the standard of living is constantly changing, especially today. So I'm just wondering what kind of recommendations do you have for establishing the ability to pay determination?
And I just want to add to that great question, how is it possible to separate an individual's ability to pay from their family, especially when you're paying a population that is dependent on them in very physical ways, like for housing or health insurance? So like the details of how you actually do that. Any thoughts?
I think that's a complicated issue. A couple of just thoughts off the top of my head, and Mitali may have some additional ones, is I do like the idea of what Karin suggested to put in that ability to pay sort of framework to also count, somehow to somehow count and take into consideration what the person is doing, right? Particularly when it comes to child support issues, what the real contribution is. We're not doing a good job measuring real contributions. So that's in the context of child support. With regard to the other financial obligations, it gets complicated for somebody who is in the criminal justice system because the criminal justice system is so disruptive to a person's life. And so it's going to be almost inevitably disruptive to their employment if they have employment. It's going to be more difficult for people to maintain and to get employment. The reality is now is the latest research suggests approximately 90% of employers do screen for past criminal justice involvement. And so it's terribly difficult for somebody who has a past conviction, even if they never spent a day in jail, to get a job. And I think we have to be realistic about that. And so, I think that what I would say is ability to pay should be sort of a moving target, if you will, that, a person should be able to, if, once it's set, and there should be discussion about, what their actual income is, what their actual income is going to be going forward. Like, for example, if somebody had a job at the point they got arrested, but lost the job, you can't count their ability to pay based on, what they made the month before they were arrested. That doesn't make sense, right? But it also has to take into account that circumstances may change going forward in terms of, somebody's going to lose a job or that kind of thing. And so allow a person to go back and petition a court if they're struggling to pay what was originally set as a payment.
Sort of two quick thoughts. I don't have a matrix in mind of what would be court context, there is an ability to pay determination, and theoretically, judges are asking a number of questions about the person's financial situation. That is not true with fees. There's no requirement that they be set based on your ability to pay, and so you can accrue fees that are just standard amounts, and it has nothing to do with what you can afford. And in a lot of jurisdictions, those amounts are quite significant. And so one step might be to at least be asking that question consistently before imposing the fee at all, which doesn't happen. And then I guess to me, number two is that this paper is also an attempt to sort of reframe the conversation. So I think even when those ability to pay determinations are made, they're often not very sympathetic. And so when we we did this paper and a prior paper, we looked at sort of court transcripts of, how it was the judge was asking these questions, and often it was very cursory or, as I said, not sympathetic. And so, for example, I think in the Brennan report, we have an example of an individual who tells the judge that he's a smoker, and he doesn't want to be a smoker, but he's a smoker. And so that means he's spending whatever it was back then, I don't know, like $6 or $8 a day on a pack of cigarettes. And the judge said, well, if you can do that, why can't you then put that $50 towards your fee? Which I guess makes a little bit of sense, but not a whole lot of sense.
Well, and as Mitali was talking, and as I was thinking about the question, I just want to give you two reflections on two conversations I had this past week. One was with a probation commissioner who, he's been around the block. I mean, he's worked with people on probation for many, many years. And so he knows what people can pay. And so he does not charge for drug testing. He does not charge for home confinement. He does not charge, he's made sure that his county's not charging people to do the pre-sentence investigation report, because from his perspective, doing so is bleeding them out, as he says, but it's also trying to do so would be to establish a very antagonistic relationship between the probation officer and the person on probation. So he's got a very practical perspective in not wanting to do that. So, some of the ability to pay assessment really comes from, just a common sense understanding of who we work with and who is caught up in the criminal justice system, which, I think really diminishing how often we impose financial penalties, to be honest. The second thing, when I was talking to this probation officer, he was talking about how at one point he sort of lost his mind with this one visiting judge, a judge visiting from another county, because this judge was imposing all these fines and fees and surcharges and everything, and asking people, sort of doing a tattoo assessment of somebody when the fee was imposed, to ensure that during the time that they were having to pay the fee and while they were under supervision, they were not getting additional tattoos. The judge was telling people, if you have a pet, you have to get rid of the pet. If you can afford a pet, then you can afford to pay this fine. Things like that, the smoking, really incredibly invasive things into people's lives as this judge's way of, saying, I know you can pay because you have a tattoo. I know you can pay because you have a dog. And so that's, I don't know where that goes, but it's like, that's the kind of consequence that arises when we start to, insist that people pay no matter what.
And I just have to take this opportunity to be a proponent of proportional fines, right? Which in Europe is a standard fare. It's called a day fine. It takes into account two things: a person's ability to pay and the severity of the offense. And it's just very striking, for example, the person who's incarcerated for $2 balance, that if you actually had to consider the severity of the offense and the person's ability to pay, we wouldn't have this panel today, right? Because you would actually have it scaled so that it made sense in a variety of fronts.
If I may, I actually experienced that with a judge, because I dressed pretty appropriately, and he looked at me and he said, that looks like a really expensive suit you have on there. If you can buy that suit, you can pay this fine. And I had to confess, I said I shoplifted the suit, so.
But I still have the tag, so I'm going to return it, right?
I'm a currently student at the Fortune Society. It's my pleasure to be here. Ms. Martin, I remember you that you was a Fortune like 2 months ago, talking about debts and our perspective. And since that day, I didn't know that we can have debts by not just child support, by just being in there. Like I remember distinctly some of my classmates. They were in some state they have to pay even rent just to be there. And when we look and we say how much money the taxpayers had to pay just for someone to be in jail, and it's around $8,000 each year just for one person, and it just don't make sense. But my real question is, we already know what is the issue, but what we should do, what we can say to the other ones to know, because when we talk about how many people go to jail, it's not just because of child support, it's because they might be sell drugs or robbery or something, but why they do it? I think that it will be because of the government, because by the time everything is increasing and increasing the rent, how much, let's say the bus, how much it used to be on the 1905, it used to be 5 cents. What about now? It's $2.50, and it will be soon $2.75. So it's not just, you can see how everything is increasing, but the real question is, how are we gonna solve it if we can afford to do this?
You see that the conversations happening out, in the public, and you're talking to people, and they're saying things like, you do the crime, you pay the time, you pay the fine, like we should punish people, people should be held accountable. You need to start to engage in those conversations with people. Understand that everybody you're talking to is a potential voter, right? And that's one of the ways to start to influence people. And in the same way with, the rhetoric from our politicians, we need to be very wise about that rhetoric, very critical. We need to start to be willing to write letters to the editor. We need to get our voices and the voices of people who've been through this out there. We need, and I think Mitali and Mary's report is very important too, because we need to start to humanize this issue. We need to be storytellers. So that people can develop a better understanding of the issue from a very human perspective. So that's some of the ways, because a lot of this has to be affected through change in legislation, but some of it also through policy change. So even at a very local level, talking to your local politicians can have a huge impact, as we see with our local commissioner of probation, who's open to these conversations. And that's just the fact that, some of his attitude is being changed about what people can really pay is really helpful for a great number of people who are under supervision in that community. So even at a small local level, these conversations with decision makers can have huge impacts.
I think that's absolutely true. Like, just 2 points about this. The notion that we ought to reconsider what child support is an important one, right? We've alluded to this a couple of times. There are many ways that parents actually care for children and other family members that are not considered by the Child Support Standards Act, which is the act that influences the amount of money you should pay. It's only money that counts, right? And that doesn't make any sense in the lives of most people who actually operate in families where they're contributing many things. But it's also about other kind of policy decisions that can be affected on a local level. For example, when I talk about welfare reform, one of the other things outside of this child support context that the Act did was that it took away things like higher education as a way of satisfying work requirements for welfare. And we all know as a policy matter that education is the fastest road out of poverty, right? And so it ran counter to what we know to work in terms of helping people move themselves to a situation where they can support their families. And on a local level here, we now have Steve Banks, who was head of Legal Aid Society, as the commissioner of HRA, who's starting to reverse that policy here in New York. So it can happen as long as we're paying attention locally to how these actions are being dealt with by our local commissioners and politicians.
And I'll just add something that I should have said at the very beginning, which is this report is really quite remarkable. Having worked in this field for a while, I can tell you that there's nothing else like it in the literature yet. And so the fact that it's humanized, as you put it, and that it was rigorously done by two people who are experts in this field makes it very valuable. So I say one thing that we can do is actually read the report if you haven't already. It's online, it's outside, and share the report. So even though you may think or have the right amount of outrage, share it so that other people have the right amount of outrage, right? And that also leads me to the other thing, which is I think, as we've talked a little bit, talked about with Anne, this area really needs kind of collaboration. It needs researcher practitioner collaboration. It needs academics to come together. It needs people who have debt to be able to actually inform this situation and to bring data to the people who have the authority to change policies. And the Fortune Society is actually a leader in this, and I'm working with them, trying to do some very rigorous surveys and interviews with people with debt, so that we can have a very solid foundation to say, this is the effect, these are the consequences, but we need so much more. I mean, this is really the first step in the right direction, and it's spectacular, but we need so much more. So I would say that even though some of us know that this is a problem and we have ideas about what we can do, there's a lot more to be done. So keep working on it. And thank you for writing such a good report.
Hi, my name is Iris Garcia, and I'm listening to what everybody's saying, but I've been in social services like so many years that sometimes your heart just gets hard because you see so many things. I mean, I see people come in low income, you have an iPhone 6, you have Air Jordans, you have this, you have that, but then you're coming and you're asking for help. I can't even afford an iPhone 6, so sometimes it's like, okay, I want to be humanistic, I want to help you, but I mean, you can afford this, you can do this, because if you can, so I think I'm like the judge, okay, you smoke a pack of cigarettes, that's $12, you can afford this. So sometimes you want to help. I think I just sit down and talk more budgeting with them, how to budget your money, how you can pay this bill, because we're not going to do this for you. And sometimes I get working in the field and just seeing, sometimes there's a lot of abuse of the system. So that's probably why a lot of people are just skeptical when it comes to, oh, let's do this policy, because a lot of the low income are abusing the system. And I'm a taxpayer, so that's more money out of my check to be paying for people that should learn to be responsible. That was my comment.
You know, a colleague of mine, Glenn Martin, has often reframed that issue for me. When people say, oh, I see people of low income who are on, public assistance, and they, have nice things. They have an iPhone, they have nice shoes, they have nice clothes. And he's reframed that issue for me very well by saying, when you have little or no social capital, how you present becomes incredibly important. It's all you have. And so it's easy, I think, and tempting and alluring, and I know I make judgments about that too. But I think it's also important to take a step back and to say, well, I don't really know what this person's whole life is like. I don't know the home that they live in. I don't know, like this might be, those Air Jordans might be the best gift that person ever got, and so they wear them all the time. That's the kind of thing you have to think about. I do think that, the system is sometimes abused. I remember when I was in law school, I was doing a lot of research on this issue, but it's sort of one of the big features, I think, of our public benefit system is that, people who really know that there's absolutely no way you can live on public benefits. You can't live on food stamps. You can't live on public assistance. And, and I tell the people I work with when they get frustrated on working with people in poverty, I remind them poverty is a full-time job. Being poor is a full-time job, just navigating every single aspect of your day, including taking the bus in a community with very poor public transportation to your appointment to meet with your case manager or whatever. That becomes exceedingly difficult. And so, I think you got to take a step back and sort of remind yourselves of those issues. But, you know, sometimes the system's abused because that's the only way to survive. And I'm not condoning it, I'm not, supporting that kind of, abuses of the system, but I think that it's sort of a myth that it happens as much as people think.
I was here before, and I just want to say, because I spent 35 years in social welfare and in welfare as a worker, as an administrator, and so forth, and I have used to stop telling people I did that, because as soon as I did, they would tell me about somebody who was standing in line behind them in food stamps, and they were buying steaks and lobsters with it, and the people couldn't. I've heard so many stories, but from my experience in 35 years, there are people who abuse it, but it's a small minority of people, and most of the people who come in have gotten there from different ways. And even when you might get annoyed with the parents because you think they're not spending the money right, I've always told my workers, well, just remember, these people have these little hostages, and you might not like what the parents are doing, but you have to remember the main program is to help the children. And so if the parents are abusing how they're spending the money, you might want to do something about it. But the children are the ones, and children do not abuse the welfare system. And so I just wanted to say that as above it. The other thing I might want to say is part of what I've done too is with child support. And unfortunately, there are, and I've met them personally, men who do not want to pay the child support. They remarry, they have other families, and they really don't want to. They're able to wipe out some of their feelings or obligations toward the original family. And it's these cases, and in different states, for instance, Florida was always really bad for just knocking down child support. But the thing is, the law, unfortunately, was written for these people rather than the ones who were paying child support and who were willing to pay for it. And that's really the problem, that the way the law was written was because of this minority of people who really didn't want to pay it, but everybody else has to suffer because of it.
And I think that's actually the inflexibility that we're talking about. The law is designed for all of the stories that you hear about people going across borders, doctors making hundreds of thousands of dollars and trying to circumvent their child support obligations. And the law was designed. And one example of how it's disproportional is with this license suspension issue. If you're trying to encourage people to pay the support that they owe, taking their license and suspending it for that purpose, if they have money and jobs and resources, makes a lot of sense, right? It's a way to compel them to do it. But if they're just trying to get a job so that they can pay, it makes no sense. But the system's application is inflexible in that way. Just one other quick thing about that. One thing I've heard, which dovetails on the last speaker, and I really appreciate you saying that, because these are real issues, right, that we have to confront when we're trying to discuss public policy. What I hear a lot is, these guys, and it is not just guys, because women go to prison too, and they're non-custodial parents, and they owe child support. So let me just degender this a little bit, okay? But what I hear a lot is these guys don't really care about their kids, and the women are taking care of the kids full time, and that seems patently unfair, and it is, right? So the idea is that we have to have a more nuanced approach to deciding what it is, what the division of labor is, how we spend our money, what it is that counts as child support, so that families in their own situations can decide how best to care for their children, right? And that's a gendered issue too, right? Because if men, in many instances, can't make money, they do a lot more child care, right? And that should be something, frankly, that we welcome.
I just want to briefly add on to that, the destination of the money that you pay really matters. So there's evidence in the report that we talked about. People do want to pay child support, but I think it's the same with restitution. In my own research, people often say, well, if I knew it was going to the victim, I would pay it, or I don't understand why it's not going to the victim. And so you can see that there's more nuance there, right? That if it was clearer where people were paying their money, we might actually have better results all around.
And I think that's right. I mean, I think so much of our policies based on the anomaly and these stories, the stories of people buying, steaks and lobster with, food stamps and, those assumptions, they drive so much of this policy, but they're not the reality for most people. And so we've got to stop making policy driven by anomalies and driven by assumptions that don't hold true for most people.
I was just saying, I thought the question was a very good one, and the other piece of that we struggled with in the paper was a lot of people would tell us, I do support my daughter, I buy her clothes every now and then, which on the one hand is a nice gesture, but on the other hand quite misses the point because that's not all it takes to raise a child. And I think we sort of thought about it in a few ways as we wrote the paper, and one was quoting Glenn actually, and that idea, and the other was just that, and we cite a lot of stories to this point in the paper, is that really it's a very rational throwing your hands up in the air, and that's the feeling we don't want to create, right? So we need a system that makes more sense so that people just don't walk away and say, well, look, I'm never going to pay this debt, so I'm going to buy really nice shoes, and turn that into a system where people find it manageable to be responsible and pay.
Right. Or I'm going to get out of the formal economy entirely because I can't pay this debt. Go into the underground economy, right, and subject themselves to reincarceration or worse, which is terrible for kids. Or work off the books, right? Remove themselves from the formal economy, which happens a lot.
Okay, back to Warth.
Marcia Weissman, Center for Community Alternatives, and this has been a really great panel and really great questions. And I want to sort of go back to a theme that has filtered through some of the conversation, and the question about sort of the nice shoes versus child support. We also forget sometimes to contextualize this question in a bigger picture, which is, this is yet another aspect of a structural system that marginalizes and oppresses poor people, and particularly people of color. So someone can stand in court and get told that he has to count his tattoos to make sure he's not getting another tattoo rather than paying a fine or some other financial penalty. And one can get told that one can't have a pet, and you have to prioritize paying this criminal justice debt. The other side of the coin that gets ignored is, well, a couple of things. One is the structural conditions that often place people in positions of desperation and behavior. The second is, and I think it goes to Glenn's point, but it sort of elevates it a bit, which is we live in a society where everything is commodified, right? And if your only value is your possessions, that's what you're going to go for, right? And last but not least, the many ostensible tax-paying citizens who are multimillionaires and dodge their taxes, right, starve the public coffers that might then make it less necessary to fine and fee for these kinds of costs, but on the other hand can afford to take their pets to spas and buy their pets luxury clothes and have cooks for their pets. And so there's something about a very race and class-driven society that creates rules and regulations and the right to be so invasive, right, about every element of someone's life, while letting people of means just completely escape any discussion about their responsibility and any effective policy making around what their obligations are as citizens to pay taxes and to contribute.
Can I just say a brief word about that? Thank you for saying that. One thing I talk about with my students all the time is the family law system in this country, and how really it is not one system, it is two systems. It's one system for people with resources where the state cannot intervene in your family absent the most compelling circumstances, right? There's a second system for poor people where the state routinely intervenes into families, with child support, with the child welfare system, with all the other systems that poor people have to experience, and they have no such illusion of privacy. So this conversation, I think, really starts in schools, where you can talk to your students about how these systems actually operate.
Hi, just wanted to say thanks for a really interesting panel and looking forward to going home and reading the report. But I just had a question. This might be outside the scope of all of your work in this area, but are there any other countries that we can look to with similar systems to ours that are maybe doing a better job with this issue? We're probably not going to compare ourselves to Sweden or Norway. You probably don't have this issue at all, but are there any countries that might be a good example for us?
Yeah, most Western European any country with a social safety net. And I don't want to be facetious, but I'm serious about that. The fact is that these issues don't even come up because there's a basic modicum of living that people expect and provide for their citizens that we just take for granted, that we don't get here.
And in other systems, the actual criminal justice system is not as politicized as it is in our country. We are a far outlier in that regard, and so that affects everything, all the decisions that we're talking about today. So every other country.
Can we do anything to be more like them besides, change everything?
No, we can change everything.
This is a revolution.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm just thinking about what she said about the Galaxy. The iPhone, so you have an iPhone 6, but you can pay, let's say, $50 every month. Well, I want to give my example. I have an iPhone 6 Plus, and I didn't buy it. My boyfriend gave it to me. I'm currently not employed, and what you said about this week, I can advise, but you can say this plan only get paid $5 by HM. There's a lot of them are cheap. We cannot just judge by what you have. And you know what? The other example, somebody said, oh, you can smoke a pack of cigarettes that is, let's say, $10, but you can pay this. And I remember once I was talking to Cammett, he worked at the Fortune Society, and he said to me once, I met a man that he smoked a cigarette. And when you smoke cigarettes by years, you got so used to that you can't live without it. It's really hard to just walk away from it. And he used to smoke for years, and once he didn't have the money to pay for it, they found him at Fortune drinking bleach. Yeah, he was killing himself. And then, for some reason, he went back to jail, and the same thing. He can't get cigarettes in there. He can't do anything, and it's just you have to see. We gotta be realistic. We gotta see the both sides. I know that you have to pay child support, yeah, because having a paper is really, really expensive. And also, it's just we have to see the both sides, not just one. We can judge. We can.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Letitia Millard. I oversee housing at the Fortune Society. And about a month and a half ago, I received a call from someone who lived in NYCHA housing, and her son had committed a crime. And what NYCHA told her, they sent her a letter, and they stated that because your son, because he lives in the home, he committed this crime, that we're evicting the entire family from housing. And the call somehow got routed to me, and I asked her, what steps has she taken so far? She said, well, I didn't know what to do, so I just accepted the judgment, and we need to know what to do. And she was trying, and I asked her about her options of affordable housing, which we know really there are none. And the affordable housing that is available there's such a long wait list for it that eventually we ended up talking about her option of just going to the shelter, which should not have been an option. But I'm just wondering, is that something that's looked at, those type of policies from NYCHA, that if someone in the family commits a crime, even though it's not the entire family was evicted from NYCHA housing, and the fact that she had no ability to find the avenues in which to kind of, I guess, protest the eviction from her housing.
I mean, I think that the issue you're raising sort of goes back to the comment that one of the people who Mitali interviewed made, which is punishment is everywhere. We're talking about one aspect of it, the financial consequences of a conviction history, but it permeates every aspect of a person's life: employment, housing, volunteer work, higher education. CCA is going to put out another paper soon about how colleges are erecting more and more barriers to higher education for people with past convictions. And so, even though we're sort of talking about this financial penalty in isolation, I think you're raising a very important issue, which is, it's just part of the bigger picture of how people and their families are punished for a crime. There is some effort there's local, statewide, and national efforts to really re-examine the extent to which sort of our tough on crime policies emerging in the 80s and 90s drove some bad legislation, again, nationally and more locally, with regard to creating barriers to housing for people with past convictions and their families. I know NYCHA has a very small pilot project right now. Very small. Thank you. Like microscopic. Hopefully something will come of that. NYCHA is one of the most draconian, if you will, public housing authorities with regard to people with past convictions. But I think that what you're illuminating is how counterproductive it is, not just for the individual, but for his family.
Thank you. So back in 2000, there was a Supreme Court case called Rucker, right? Rucker v. U.S. And it was about a grandmother in a public housing authority on the West Coast, I think in Oakland, whose grandson was smoking a joint 3 blocks away from the housing project, and the whole family was evicted. Well, the Supreme Court decided 8-0 that was okay. All right, so it's a strict liability standard that many public housing authorities around the country have adopted. But as a practical matter, what some people do in those situations, and this is horrible, again, it's state intervention into families, is they allow a mother like that to exclude her son permanently from the house. And you can work out a deal with a housing manager to do that. But what does that say about your relationship with your child? So it's kind of a Hobson's choice in that sense.
In Middlesex County, I've experienced, I saw individuals who owned private houses. They lived in this house, and because they got a drug offense on that street, the courts issued a restraining order on the individual to be anywhere in that vicinity. So he couldn't return home even after serving his time. And it was privately owned house.
I think my biggest fear with this paper is that it being misquoted as, this criminal not only is impacting society in a negative way, but look, they're free riding off their family. That's my biggest fear in releasing this paper. And I think what the real story is that these are families and communities who want to support their loved ones who are in the criminal justice system. That our criminal justice system casts such a wide net for such a range of small offenses that it very often is the case that that these families want to support their loved one, don't want to be separated in terms of housing, and that it's not a emotional burden. And I think someone else had brought this up earlier, is that research shows that it's very important for these people who are returning home to have these strong networks of family support, and that we're creating tensions through the financial obligations and other penalties that sort of pit the person in the criminal justice system against their family members.
Good morning. So Ronald Day from the Fortune Society. I oversee the data Ronald person for public policy. And the question I have is, I oftentimes see the usual suspects at these type of events. And so I'm wondering, because this information is extremely important, and a lot of times the folks that enact and apply the laws and regulations are the ones that are least informed. So how is it that we go about taking the show on the road and or ensuring that as much as possible, like I heard you say you're going down to Virginia soon, so how do we ensure that is exact, that is what's happening?
I think the sliver of hope on this particular issue is that it is not always the usual suspects actually that agree that we have gone too far on child support and fees and fines. And
I'm
so
talking about that are at the meetings, though.
No, but, well, so I think there are policy examples. So for example, I think in New Jersey, Chris Christie's administration tried to do a lot to have very active policies around forgiving past debt owed to the state. And that's the Republican administration. I think that's just one example. So I think actually this particular issue is one in which people are starting to have more nuanced conversation.
Yeah, I think I suggested earlier that that's why I teach, right? That's why I'm in a law school, because I actually get to help students frame these issues in a way that they see intersections. Most of the time we are living in silos when we think about problems, right? And so for criminal lawyers, we think only about, the problems with people losing their liberty. We don't think about collateral consequences, right? As civil lawyers, we don't really associate with criminal law at all, right? And so bridging that divide is very important in terms of moving this conversation forward to see how these issues affect the person, right? Not their case, whether it be civil or criminal.
I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound flippant, but it's not. It's sort of like, part of what we need to do is befriend a Republican. But what I'm really saying is we need to, in our social circles and in our daily lives, we need to be courageous to have these conversations and to confront some of the language that is very punitive and counterproductive. And that's hard to do because you don't want to alienate people, but there is a way to do it that's courageous, polite, respectful, and can really shift people's minds. And so that's what even though Ronald, I'm with you, I'd like to see more people in this room that I haven't seen before, but I'm glad everybody's in this room. Go out, befriend a Republican, have these conversations, have the courage to tell these stories.
Any more questions? I'd like to ask panelists to just kind of leave us with what you think the most important takeaway is for the audience. What is the one thing you want us all to remember from this event?
I think that this report's very important. Read it. Because I think one of the things that we forget is that, for the most part, people are doing the best that they can, right? And that the policies that we have enacted over time, right, judge people based on the worst of the lot, right? And if you start with the position that people are doing the best that they can, how can we empower them to do better for their kids, for their communities, and for themselves, and really talk about policy in that way, I think will go a long way.
And I would like people to really see that there are people who are really trying to resolve their issues and pay their debt back to society. But with all the barriers that are put in the way, it makes it a lot more difficult than it has to be.
And I would dovetail on that to say, the people who we work with who have child support arrears and past criminal justice involvement, I'm actually more often than not pleasantly surprised by the profound sense of responsibility that such individuals have for wanting to live a productive, dignified life in the community, wanting to be a contributing member of the community, wanting to have a prominent, important role in their family. And I think that from my perspective, that's the framework from which we need to come when we develop these policies, instead of the opposite assumptions that all too often drive our policies.
There's one other sort of place this report came from, and that's from having done legislative advocacy on this issue. And so we were often told by legislators that there were two things they wish they could say. One is that this does hurt families and communities in a broader way, and two, that it costs more to collect than they're actually collecting. I think we talked a little bit about the collection and cost issue. I think it's complicated to be able to say that. But this report speaks to the other piece of that, and I think it's something that legislators really feel could sort of turn the conversation. And so I hope that you'll use the report.
Just want to thank everybody again for attending and thank our panelists. It was fantastic. And look for more PRI occasional